Imagine sitting in your own home, thinking you're safe, when suddenly the front door clicks open, not by you, not by your family, but by your HOA neighbor. Now picture the look on her face when she realizes the police are already waiting inside. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, the kind where you finally feel at peace with the world. The house was filled with the soft smell of fresh coffee, and the gentle sunlight spilled through the curtains, painting the walls with a warm golden glow. I had just settled into my chair with the idea of enjoying a slow, peaceful day. The neighborhood outside was calm too, only the faint sound of a lawnmower somewhere in the distance. Everything felt still, safe, and ordinary, until the moment that calm was shattered. At first, it was subtle, a faint metallic click. I thought maybe I imagined it. But then I heard it again, clear as day, the unmistakable sound of my front door lock turning. My heart jumped into my throat. Nobody was supposed to be coming over. I froze in my chair, listening. For a second, I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, maybe just the wind, or maybe the lock shifting. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. Someone was opening my door. The door creaked, slowly swinging open, and there she was. Karen, the infamous woman from our HOA, the one who seemed to live for making my life miserable. Her face appeared in the doorway with that same smug look I had seen 100 times before at community meetings. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. She just walked in like she owned the place, as if crossing my threshold was no different than stepping onto her porch. I sat frozen, caught between shock and anger, watching as she stepped into my living room. Her eyes darted around, scanning everything in sight. My furniture, the pictures on my wall, even the shoes by the door. It wasn't a casual glance either. It was the sharp, judgmental stare of someone searching for flaws. She muttered under her breath, something about community safety inspections, her voice dripping with fake authority. I clenched my jaw so hard it hurt. She had no reason, no right, and yet here she was, violating the one place I should have felt safe. Karen had always been like this. She thrived on control. To her, the HOA wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood neat. It was her personal kingdom, and everyone else was a subject to boss around. She made rules out of nothing, twisted guidelines to fit her mood, and bullied anyone who dared to push back. She had written me letters about the color of my curtains, complained about the way I parked my truck, and once even knocked on my door because my grass was a half-inch too tall. It was exhausting. But this was different. She had crossed a line no one should ever cross. This wasn't a complaint or a nasty letter. This was my home, my private space, and she had unlocked the door as if she had every right to walk in. My blood boiled, but I forced myself to stay calm, because what Karen didn't know was that I had already been one step ahead of her. Weeks before this moment, I had caught her peeking through my windows, pretending to walk her dog, but always lingering near my property. I had reported her behavior to the police, telling them I was worried it might escalate. They listened carefully and told me that if she ever tried anything again, I should call immediately. They even hinted that if she stepped foot inside without permission, it would be trespassing, something far more serious than a simple nuisance. So when I heard that lock turn, when I saw her bold face step through my doorway, I knew she wasn't just bothering me anymore. She was breaking the law. And the best part? She didn't realize that her arrogance had led her straight into a trap. Because while she thought she was in control, while she strutted around my living room with her clipboard and her fake authority, she had no idea that justice was already waiting for her inside. Karen strutted further inside, holding a clipboard like she was some kind of official inspector. Her heels clicked against the floor as she moved around, pretending to take notes. She pointed at little things, like the plants near the window or a stack of mail on the counter, shaking her head as if she had discovered some kind of violation. Her whole attitude screamed confidence. She truly believed she was untouchable, that her HOA title gave her the power to barge into my life and pick apart everything I owned. I stood silently, my arms crossed, watching her performance. It was almost unbelievable how far she was willing to go. Every word she spoke dripped with superiority. She said things like, "This doesn't match community standards," and "You're in violation of HOA guidelines." She was building up her little case as if she was going to drag me into another exhausting HOA meeting. But what she didn't realize was that this wasn't her stage anymore. As she walked toward the hallway, about to snoop even deeper into my home, her body suddenly went stiff. Her eyes widened. She froze mid-step. Because right there, only a few feet away, stood two uniformed police officers, quietly waiting for the right moment. The clipboard in her hand began to shake. The smug smile on her face melted into shock, then fear. She stammered, her mouth opening and closing, searching for words that simply wouldn't come out. The officers stepped forward calmly, their presence filling the room with authority that Karen couldn't ignore. One of them asked in a steady voice, "Ma'am, what are you doing inside this home?" His question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Karen blinked rapidly, her confidence draining away. She scrambled to explain, waving her clipboard like it was some sort of legal pass. I'm with the HOA. I'm allowed to check for violations," she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her own lie. The officer didn't even flinch. He looked her straight in the eye and said, "This is private property. You are trespassing. You do not have any legal authority to be here without the homeowner's permission." His words cut through her excuses like a knife. Karen tried again, desperate now, insisting that she had the right to enter because of community rules. But the officer shut her down instantly. He explained that HOA guidelines were not above the law, and nothing in their rules gave her permission to unlock and enter someone's home. The silence that followed was golden. Karen, who had built her reputation on intimidating neighbors and bending rules to her will, was suddenly powerless. Her face turned pale, her bravado gone. She looked smaller somehow, like the walls of my living room were closing in on her. For the first time, she had no control. I stood there watching, a mix of relief and satisfaction washing over me. For so long, Karen had been a shadow over my life, always looking for ways to catch me doing something wrong. She had threatened, lectured, and embarrassed me in front of others. But in that moment, all her power crumbled. She wasn't the enforcer anymore. She was the offender. The officers escorted her toward the door, reminding her that breaking into someone's home was a serious offense. They warned her that if she ever tried anything like this again, she could face criminal charges. Karen's head hung low, and she mumbled something about a misunderstanding, but nobody believed her. The humiliation was written all over her face. As the door shut behind her and the officers made their final notes, I finally felt the heavy weight lift off my shoulders. My home was safe again. My peace was restored. The neighborhood soon buzzed with the story, and word spread fast. Everyone who had been bullied by Karen in the past now knew she wasn't untouchable. She wasn't above the law. From that day forward, she never dared to cross my line again. She avoided eye contact, kept her distance, and stayed quiet at meetings. For the first time, she learned that her reign of intimidation was over. And I learned something too, that sometimes the best way to stop a bully is to let them trap themselves in their own arrogance. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life style stories of justice, don't forget to subscribe to HD Stories. Your support helps us bring even more powerful stories straight to you. Hit the like button, drop a comment about what you would have done in this situation, and make sure to turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. This is HD Stories, where every tale reminds you that truth and justice always find their way. You ever think you've seen the worst of HOA Karens? Think again. Imagine your pregnant wife struggling to breathe. You rush her to the emergency room. And just when doctors are trying to help, a screaming HOA Karen storms in and drags her out like it's her property. What happened next shocked everyone. But when the courtroom saw the hospital tape, it was game over. Before we dive in, comment which country you're watching from. It all started on what was supposed to be one of the happiest and most peaceful days of my life. My wife, Emily, and I had just moved into a quiet, beautiful neighborhood, a place that looked straight out of a family magazine. The lawns were perfectly trimmed, the houses freshly painted, and neighbors waved politely from across the street. It seemed like the perfect environment to start our new life together as we prepared to welcome our first child. We were both so excited, decorating the nursery, buying baby clothes, and dreaming about our future. But it didn't take long for that dream to turn into something else entirely. Because behind all the smiles and polite waves was a woman named Karen Dalton, the HOA president, who acted like the entire community was her personal empire. She sent out fines for the smallest things, like leaving a garden hose inside or parking an inch too close to the curb. We tried to stay under her radar, thinking that if we just minded our own business, she'd leave us alone. We couldn't have been more wrong. A few weeks later, on a warm Saturday morning, everything changed. Emily started feeling dizzy and weak. Her breathing became shallow, and she kept holding her stomach. Panic flooded through me. She was 7 months pregnant, and we still had a long way to go before the due date. Without wasting a second, I grabbed the car keys and rushed her to the nearest hospital. The drive felt endless, every red light torturing me, every glance at her pale face making my heart pound harder. When we finally reached the ER, doctors took her in immediately. They started running tests while I filled out paperwork, my hands trembling. I could finally breathe for a moment, thinking the worst was over. But just when things were beginning to calm down, I heard a voice that made my stomach twist. A loud, shrill, and all too familiar voice echoing down the hallway. It was Karen. She burst through the ER doors, waving a clipboard in her hand like she owned the place. Her face was red, her eyes wide, and she was shouting something about improper parking. For a second, I thought I was hallucinating. What was an HOA president doing here? In a hospital, of all places? Then she spotted me and marched straight toward the room where Emily was being treated. "You can't just leave your car in the community parking lot without authorization," she yelled, ignoring the nurses trying to stop her. "That's a direct violation of HOA policy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wife was on a hospital bed, struggling to stay calm, and this woman was ranting about neighborhood rules. I told her to leave, that this wasn't the time or the place, but she only got louder. "You people think you can just ignore the rules whenever it suits you," she snapped, jabbing her finger in my direction. "You're setting a terrible example for the community." Emily's breathing quickened, tears filled her eyes, and I could see the fear in her face. The stress was too much for her. A nurse tried to step in, telling Karen to leave immediately, but she shoved past her and actually grabbed my wife's arm. "You need to leave this hospital right now," Karen shouted. "You're trespassing. Your HOA dues aren't even current." The entire room froze. For a moment, I couldn't even move. Then I heard the nurse pull the emergency cord, and within seconds, hospital security rushed in. They restrained Karen as she kicked and screamed about her legal authority, insisting she had every right to be there. The entire ER had gone silent, everyone watching in disbelief. After that, I filed a police report that same night. Karen was charged with trespassing, harassment, and assault. The HOA board tried to brush it off as a misunderstanding, but I wasn't letting it slide. Not after what she did to my wife, an unborn child. We had witnesses, we had footage, and I was determined to make her face consequences. But what I didn't expect was how far Karen would go next, because instead of backing down, she doubled down, and the real battle was only beginning. The court date finally arrived, and the tension in the air could have been cut with a knife. The courtroom was packed to the walls. Neighbors who once stayed quiet, HOA members who used to nod along with Karen, and even a few local reporters who'd caught wind of the story. Everyone wanted to see how this would play out. Karen walked in like she was walking a red carpet, wearing a bright red blazer and that same smug expression she always carried. She whispered to people in the hallway, laughing, saying she was confident the truth would come out and clear her name. She truly believed she was untouchable. But that confidence began to crack the moment the judge entered the room. When the prosecutor started speaking, the tone in the courtroom changed. He laid out every detail: the trespassing, the assault, the hospital incident. Karen kept shaking her head, muttering under her breath, acting like it was all some big misunderstanding. But when the hospital's head of security was called to the stand, everyone went silent. The prosecutor asked to play a piece of evidence that would speak for itself. They wheeled in a television and pressed play. The video showed Karen storming into the emergency room, her voice echoing through the halls. Everyone could hear her shouting about parking violations while Emily was lying in the hospital bed, frightened and struggling to breathe. Then came the moment that made the entire courtroom gasp: Karen grabbing Emily's arm, pulling her as if she were dragging someone off private property. The camera captured everything. You could hear me shouting for her to stop and the nurses rushing to intervene. When the clip ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Karen's face went pale. She tried to speak, but the judge raised his hand. "I've seen enough," he said sternly. His voice carried authority, and even Karen seemed to shrink in her seat. The judge turned to her lawyer and said, "If your client has any sense, she'll remain quiet for the rest of this proceeding." Then he looked directly at Karen. This is one of the most disgraceful displays of power abuse I have ever seen in this courtroom. You didn't just break a rule, you broke human decency. The prosecutor reminded everyone that this wasn't just about HOA rules. This was about a woman who violated hospital security, assaulted a pregnant patient, and endangered 2 lives, all because of an inflated ego and a hunger for control. Karen tried to defend herself, saying she was only trying to protect the HOA's image, but no one was buying it anymore. Even the other HOA board members who once supported her sat stone-faced, refusing to meet her eyes. When the verdict was finally read, the air shifted completely. Karen Dalton was found guilty of trespassing, harassment, and assault. The judge sentenced her to community service, issued a restraining order keeping her 500 feet away from our home, and ordered her to pay restitution for the damages she caused. But what really broke her spirit came afterward. The HOA board voted unanimously to remove her as president. She wasn't just legally punished. She lost the very power she'd used to torment others. As Emily and I walked out of the courthouse, something unexpected happened. Neighbors who once avoided us came forward. They apologized for staying silent, for not standing up sooner. Some even shared their own stories, how Karen fined them unfairly or humiliated them in meetings. It turned out she had been bullying the whole neighborhood for years, and now, finally, her reign was over. For the first time in months, Emily smiled again. She looked lighter, freer, like a weight had finally lifted from her chest. She squeezed my hand and said softly, "We can finally breathe again." A few weeks later, our daughter was born, healthy, beautiful, and full of life. We named her Hope, because that's exactly what she brought into our world. Hope that justice still exists, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you. Hope that no matter how powerful someone pretends to be, the truth will always win in the end. To this day, I keep that court recording on my phone. Sometimes, when I feel frustrated or lose faith in people, I watch it again, not to relive the anger, but to remind myself that even when the Karens of the world scream the loudest, they can never silence what's right. Because in the end, truth, courage, and hope always speak louder. If you believe justice always finds a way, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. This is HD Stories, where real drama meets real justice. Imagine your teenage son just hanging out in the front yard when suddenly, the HOA sends cops after him, treating him like a criminal. But what they didn't know was that 2 Navy SEALs were visiting that very day, and they weren't about to let anyone mess with family. It was a calm Saturday afternoon, one of those days where the sun was warm but not too hot, and the air carried that weekend feeling of freedom. My 16-year-old son, Ethan, was outside in our driveway, bouncing his basketball and laughing with 2 of his friends. The sound of the ball hitting the concrete mixed with their voices and the occasional shout when someone made a good shot. They weren't causing trouble. They weren't even loud enough to disturb anyone with their windows shut. It was just kids enjoying their youth. But in neighborhoods like ours, there's always someone watching for the smallest thing to complain about. In our case, it was the HOA president. She had a reputation for nitpicking, whether it was the color of someone's curtains, a trash bin left out a little too long, or even the type of flowers planted in front yards. And for some reason, she had taken a special interest in our family. I'll never forget the moment she walked past, glaring at the boys like they were a pack of delinquents. She didn't say a word to me. She just stormed off, her phone already in her hand. At first, I thought she was probably just going to fire off one of her usual complaint letters. But 15 minutes later, I heard the sound of sirens. 2 police cars pulled up right in front of my house, lights flashing. My stomach dropped. The officers stepped out, serious and alert, as though they were responding to something dangerous. My son froze mid-dribble, his eyes wide with confusion. His friends backed away, whispering nervously, not sure what was happening. I rushed outside, demanding to know what was going on. One of the officers asked Ethan for his name and told him to put the ball down. They wanted to see his ID. He was only 16. He didn't even carry one yet. The way they questioned him, as if he were some kind of criminal, broke my heart. Ethan stammered, struggling to answer, his face pale. He kept looking at me, silently begging for help, and all I could think was how unfair this was. Neighbors started peeking out from behind curtains, some even stepping onto their porches. Whispers spread like wildfire. It didn't matter that my son hadn't done anything wrong. The flashing lights made it look like he had. That was the worst part. Watching my boy's innocence being dragged through the mud over something so small. My blood boiled with every second, knowing someone had deliberately escalated this. And that someone was standing just down the street, arms crossed, watching with satisfaction. The HOA president. Just when the situation seemed to be spiraling out of control, the rumble of a pickup truck echoed down the street. It was a sound I recognized instantly. My brothers had arrived. They were stopping by to surprise Ethan, who looked up to them more than anyone else. But they weren't just regular uncles. Both had served as Navy SEALs, men who had faced real danger, real enemies, and had earned the kind of respect you don't question. The truck rolled to a stop right behind the police cars, and out stepped two tall, broad-shouldered men in plain clothes, sunglasses on, calm but alert. Their presence alone shifted the air. Neighbors who had been whispering suddenly went quiet, curious to see what would happen next. The officers glanced over, their body language changing the moment they realized these weren't just random bystanders. My brothers didn't rush, they didn't yell. They walked with steady confidence, the kind that comes from years of discipline. One of them, Daniel, nodded politely to the officers before asking, in a firm voice, "Excuse me, what seems to be the problem here?" The officer, caught off guard, tried to explain that there had been a report of rowdy teens causing a disturbance. Daniel looked at Ethan, still standing there with his basketball at his feet, and then back at the officer. His tone sharpened. "That's not a disturbance. That's a kid playing hoops in his own driveway. Since when is that a crime?" The other brother, Marcus, turned his attention to the HOA president, who had finally worked up the courage to march over. She wore that smug look, the one that said she thought she had the upper hand. But Marcus didn't flinch. He looked her straight in the eye, calm but cutting. "You mean to tell me you called the police on your neighbor's teenage son for playing basketball?" His voice carried enough authority that even the officers paused. The president tried to defend herself, mumbling something about rules and safety, but the words fell flat under his gaze. Neighbors, now gathered in small groups, started shaking their heads, whispering louder. For once, the tide wasn't in her favor. Daniel turned back to the officers. "Gentlemen, I respect the job you do. But this isn't what you signed up for. You've got bigger battles to fight than harassing kids because someone doesn't like the sound of a basketball." His words weren't angry, but they cut deep. You could see the discomfort on the officers' faces. They knew they'd been dragged into nonsense. For the first time that day, Ethan's shoulders relaxed. He looked at his uncles with pure relief, his fear melting into something closer to pride. The boy who had been treated like a criminal now stood protected by men who knew what real courage looked like. And everyone watching could feel the shift. The power was no longer in the HOA's hands. The officers, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted on their feet. They looked at my son again, standing there with nothing but a basketball, and realized how ridiculous this entire situation had become. One of them sighed and finally said, "Ma'am, there's no violation here. This is just a teenager playing in his driveway." His words hung heavy in the air, and I could almost feel the pride swelling in my chest. But my brothers weren't done. Daniel took a step closer to the HOA president, his voice calm but razor sharp. "Do you understand what you've just done? You humiliated a child in front of his neighbors. You made him feel like a criminal. And for what? Because you don't like the sound of a basketball? That's not leadership. That's bullying." The HOA president's smug expression faltered. Her lips tightened, but she couldn't find the right words. She tried to mumble something about neighborhood peace and following the rules, but the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. People who had once been silent out of fear now started speaking up. One man shouted from across the street, "My kids play outside too. Are you going to call the cops on them next?" Another neighbor chimed in, "We're tired of this nonsense. This isn't a prison. It's supposed to be our home." Murmurs turned into louder voices, and suddenly the HOA president wasn't in control anymore. She was surrounded by the very people she thought she ruled over, and none of them were on her side. Marcus folded his arms and said in a low voice only she could hear, "This ends now. Next time you think about harassing our family, or any family, you'd better remember who you're messing with." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, backed by the weight of men who had faced far greater battles than HOA politics. The police officers, clearly wanting to wrap things up, apologized directly to Ethan. One of them even patted his shoulder and said, "You're not in any trouble, son. Keep playing ball." That small gesture meant the world to him. His face lit up, and for the first time since the flashing lights appeared, I saw my boy smile again. As the cops drove away, neighbors slowly returned to their homes, but the whispers and side-eyes aimed at the HOA president didn't stop. Her reputation, once built on intimidation, crumbled in front of everyone. She turned and stormed off, but the damage was done. People had seen her for who she really was, a bully hiding behind rules. That night, Ethan sat at the dinner table and told us how scared he'd been when the cops first showed up. But he also said something that stuck with me. "I wasn't scared once Uncle Daniel and Uncle Marcus showed up. I knew everything would be okay." And he was right. That day, my son learned that sometimes standing up to bullies takes more than words. It takes strength, courage, and the willingness to protect what's right. The HOA never called the cops on him again, and from that moment on, our neighborhood changed. People stopped being silent. They started pushing back. What began as an attempt to humiliate a teenager ended with the fall of an HOA president's control. And it all happened because two Navy SEALs showed up at the right time and reminded everyone what real strength looks like. And that's how a simple basketball game turned into a lesson about courage, family, and standing up to bullies. Ethan walked away stronger. The HOA president lost her power, and justice finally spoke louder than fear. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life style battles against HOA drama, don't forget to like this video, share it with friends, and drop your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to subscribe to HD Stories and hit the bell icon, because we've got more unbelievable stories coming your way. Stories you won't want to miss. They thought they could scare us with rules, threats, and even the police. What the HOA didn't know was that my wife isn't someone you can intimidate, because she's the county sheriff. When the cops arrived at our door, the entire neighborhood expected us to be dragged out in handcuffs. Instead, what happened next left the HOA speechless, and everyone watching learned a lesson they'll never forget. When my wife and I first moved into the neighborhood, we were excited about starting a new chapter of our lives. The house was everything we had hoped for: quiet, comfortable, and with just enough space for us to finally feel at home. We imagined peaceful evenings on the porch, planting flowers in the yard, and maybe even hosting a barbecue with the neighbors once we settled in. But little did we know, trouble was waiting for us the very first day. The HOA president came strutting over like she owned the entire block. She had a clipboard in one hand, a fake smile on her face, and the kind of attitude that told you she wasn't here to welcome us. Without even saying, "Welcome to the neighborhood," she immediately started going through a list of rules. She told us where we could park, how tall our grass should be, what color we were allowed to paint our mailbox, and even how many flower pots were acceptable in the front yard. At first, I thought she was just trying to be helpful, but the way she spoke, it wasn't advice. It was a demand. We smiled politely and listened, but as soon as she left, my wife shook her head. She told me, "This woman isn't here to help us. She's here to control us." I laughed it off at first, thinking maybe she was just exaggerating, but it didn't take long for me to see she was absolutely right. Within a week, the letters began. Every morning, we would find a folded paper taped to our front door. At first, I thought they were friendly reminders, but the language in those letters told a different story. They weren't just about small things, they were written to humiliate us. Words like non-compliant, eyesore, and rule breakers jumped off the page. They accused us of being careless homeowners, of not respecting community standards, and even of bringing down property values. One letter claimed that my truck was parked 2 inches over the line in our driveway. Another said the small wreath my wife had hung on our front door was unauthorized decor. The most ridiculous one complained that our garbage bin had been visible for 5 minutes longer than the acceptable time frame. Each letter was signed off with the HOA president's name, like she was proud of every insult. My wife, being calm and collected, told me not to let it get under my skin. She reminded me that we weren't doing anything wrong and that we had every right to live in our own home without being bullied. But I could see the frustration building inside her. She's strong, but she doesn't like being pushed around, especially when she knows someone is abusing their power. The final straw came when we planted a small garden in our front yard. It wasn't anything big, just some flowers, herbs, and a couple of vegetables my wife loved to grow. It made the house feel alive, colorful, and welcoming. But one evening, as the sun was setting, 3 HOA board members marched up our driveway like they were on an official mission. They didn't ask us about the garden. They demanded we remove it immediately. My wife stood her ground. She looked them straight in the eyes and said, "No, this is our home. We own this property, and we have every right to enjoy it." The board members didn't like that answer. Their faces turned red with anger, and the president muttered something under her breath about teaching us a lesson. At the time, I didn't fully understand what she meant, but soon, it would become very clear. The next morning started like any other. The sun was barely up, and I was sipping my coffee by the kitchen window when I noticed movement outside. At first, I thought it was just neighbors out for a walk, but then I saw 2 police cars parked right in front of our house. My heart sank immediately. Before I even had time to process it, there was a loud, heavy knock on the front door. Sharp, commanding, the kind of knock that makes your chest tighten. I opened the door, and there they were, 2 police officers standing tall, serious expressions on their faces, hands resting on their holsters. Behind them, just a few feet back on the sidewalk, stood the HOA president with her arms crossed and a smug grin spread across her face. She looked like she was enjoying every second of this, like she had finally found a way to put us in our place. The officer spoke firmly, asking if we were the homeowners and if we understood that we had been reported for multiple violations and for refusing to comply with community rules. I glanced at the HOA president, and she smirked, nodding her head as if to say, "Yes, that's them. Take them away." Neighbors had already begun peeking out from their windows and stepping onto their porches. Some whispered to each other, others just stared, waiting to see us humiliated. It felt like the whole block had been waiting for this moment, and the HOA president was eating up every bit of attention. I won't lie, my stomach twisted with nerves. No matter how innocent you are, seeing police show up at your door with that kind of presence is intimidating. That's exactly what the HOA wanted. They weren't just trying to fine us or send a warning anymore. They wanted to scare us into submission. But my wife? She was calm as stone. She stepped forward, gently moving me aside, and looked the officers directly in the eyes. Her voice was steady when she said, "Before we go any further, you need to know something about me." The officers exchanged quick glances, a little confused. My wife reached over to the table inside the house, picked up her badge, and held it out for them to see. The moment their eyes landed on it, their entire demeanor shifted. One of the officers straightened up immediately, his serious expression melting into shock and recognition. "You're the sheriff?" he asked, almost stumbling over his words. "That's right," she said calmly. "I am the elected county sheriff, and I'd like to know why you were called here over a garden and a wreath on my front door." The silence that followed was heavy. The HOA president's smug grin disappeared instantly. Her face drained of color, and she actually took a step back as the realization hit her. The crowd of neighbors who had been watching with curiosity suddenly grew quiet too. Everyone could feel the shift. The officers, now clearly embarrassed, lowered their voices and explained that they had been told we were refusing to follow the law, that we were hostile and uncooperative. My wife raised an eyebrow and asked them if planting flowers was a crime in this county. The officers shook their heads quickly, apologizing under their breath. The tension broke, but the message was clear. The HOA had gone way too far. What was meant to be an act of intimidation had just blown up in their faces. And the best part? The entire neighborhood had witnessed it. The moment the truth came out, the entire scene flipped upside down. The officers who had arrived ready to enforce the HOA's complaints were now apologizing to us. They lowered their tone, showing respect to my wife, and explained that they had no idea who they were walking up to. My wife nodded but didn't let them off the hook so easily. She pointed out how serious this was, not just for us, but for the officers themselves. She reminded them that responding to false reports wastes valuable time and resources that should be spent on real emergencies. Then she turned her attention to the HOA president. My wife's voice was steady, but firm, the kind of tone that makes people freeze in their tracks. She told her flat out that making false accusations could be considered harassment, even filing a false police report. The HOA president tried to mumble an excuse, but the damage was already done. She had been exposed in front of neighbors, officers, and the entire community. The officers gave her a warning on the spot, telling her this behavior needed to stop immediately. The embarrassment on her face was undeniable, Her authority, her control, her so-called power over the neighborhood had crumbled in just a matter of minutes. From that day forward, everything changed. No more letters, no more threats, no more smug visits. The HOA board kept their distance, and neighbors who had once stayed quiet now came to us privately, relieved that someone had finally stood up to the bullies. My wife didn't just protect our home, she protected the community. And the HOA learned a lesson they would never forget. You don't send cops after the sheriff. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good twist. Drop a comment below and tell me what you would have done in this situation. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe to HD Stories for more powerful real-life style stories that keep you hooked until the very end. Imagine waking up one morning to find your fence cut clean through, your private land, violated like it was some public shortcut. Now picture the person responsible standing there proudly, arms crossed, claiming she had every right to do it. That's what happened to me. The HOA president, Karen, thought she could tear down my fence to give her community easy access to the lake. But what she didn't know was that her little stunt was about to backfire in the worst possible way. And I had the perfect plan to stop her. You won't believe the nerve of some people. Imagine this. You're enjoying a quiet morning, sipping your coffee, listening to the birds, and looking out across the land that's been in your family for generations. You've worked hard to keep it safe, clean, and private. Then suddenly, you notice something out of place, something that makes your stomach drop. The fence, the one that's supposed to protect your property and mark your boundary, isn't just damaged. It's been cut clean through. Now, let me be clear. This wasn't some old, falling apart fence. I'd built it sturdy, reinforced it to hold back my horses and cattle, and maintained it regularly. It was strong enough to withstand storms, high winds, even the occasional wild animal trying to test it. This wasn't an accident. The wooden beams weren't cracked from age or weather. They were sliced, as if someone had taken a saw to them deliberately. The opening was wide enough for people to walk through comfortably. At first, I couldn't wrap my head around it. Who would have the audacity to cut through private property like this? Maybe it was a careless contractor, I thought. Maybe they got their lots mixed up while doing work nearby. Or maybe some kids had been messing around with tools they shouldn't have been playing with. I tried to convince myself there had to be some logical explanation. But then I saw her. Standing at the gap in my fence was Karen, the president of the neighborhood HOA. She had her arms crossed, chin lifted, and this smug look on her face like she had just accomplished something for the greater good. Behind her, a couple of residents from her subdivision stood nodding approvingly, as if this destruction of my property was something to celebrate. When I confronted her, she didn't even flinch. She didn't apologize. She didn't act embarrassed. Instead, she gave me this dismissive smile and said, "This path gives the neighborhood easier access to the lake. Your fence was blocking us." I was stunned. I thought I must have misheard her. The lake she was talking about sat beyond my land. And yes, it was beautiful. But my property wasn't some public trail. It wasn't a park or a shortcut designed for her community's convenience. It was private land, my family's land. And my fence wasn't blocking them. It was protecting me, my animals, and my rights as a property owner. Yet the way Karen looked at me, you'd think she believed she had every right to make that decision. She stood tall, as if she had done something noble for the people in her HOA. But all I saw was arrogance. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about a broken fence. This was about power. Karen thought the rules didn't apply to her, and she was more than willing to bulldoze over anyone who stood in her way. And sadly, this was only the beginning of the storm she was about to bring into my life. After the fence incident, I thought things couldn't possibly get worse. I repaired the damage, reinforced the boards, and even added fresh, private property and no trespassing signs to make it crystal clear that no one, not even the mighty HOA president, had the right to step foot on my land. I figured that would be the end of it. But with someone like Karen, nothing is ever that simple. The very next week, she started her campaign. Karen was the type who thrived on control, and when someone dared to tell her no, she made it her mission to turn the whole neighborhood against them. Suddenly, I was being painted as the villain. She told everyone that I was selfish, that I was hurting the community by keeping the lake path blocked. According to her, I was some greedy landowner hoarding natural beauty that should belong to the people. And people bought it. Soon, whenever I drove through the nearby town, I noticed neighbors glaring at me. Folks I had never even spoken to shook their heads as I passed. Some even yelled things like, "Stop being so selfish," or "Let people enjoy the lake." All because Karen had spun a story that made her sound like the hero fighting against the big bad rancher. But her antics didn't stop with gossip. Oh no, she escalated. One day, I received a letter in the mail with the HOA's official letterhead. It was a notice of violation. According to the letter, I was being fined for restricting community access and for having unsafe fencing that posed a hazard to residents. Now let me be clear, I wasn't even a member of the HOA. My ranch sat completely outside their jurisdiction. Yet here they were, acting like they had authority over me. Of course, I refused to pay. Why would I give them a dime? That's when the harassment began. Members of the HOA started walking right up to my property line, deliberately pushing the boundaries. They'd walk their dogs as close as possible to my fence, linger, and stare into my land like they were inspecting it. I caught one guy with binoculars, peering into my yard as if he was conducting an investigation. It was creepy, invasive, and infuriating. Then came the confrontation. One afternoon, I was out by the barn when I saw Karen marching up my driveway like she owned the place. She didn't bother to call ahead or even knock politely. She stomped right up to me, her voice sharp and dripping with entitlement. "You're going to regret this," she said. "The HOA has power, and if you don't let us through, we'll make your life miserable." I stood there in disbelief. She was threatening me on my own property after already cutting down my fence. But instead of backing down, I felt a surge of determination. Because what Karen didn't know was that she had just poked the wrong bear. You see, my land didn't just include the fields and fences she wanted to cross. It also included the only private road that her precious HOA neighborhood used to connect to the main highway. For years, I had been kind enough to let them use it, cutting their drive time by nearly 10 minutes. They had gotten so comfortable with that shortcut, they thought it was theirs by right. But it wasn't. It was mine. And in that moment, I realized exactly how to put an end to Karen's games once and for all. The very next week, I put my plan into action. First, I called my lawyer to double-check what I already knew deep down. That road cutting through my land, the very road the HOA used every single day, was mine and mine alone. Sure enough, the property records were ironclad. The HOA had zero legal claim to it. For years, I had allowed them to use it out of neighborly goodwill. But goodwill only stretches so far when it's being abused. So, I did what Karen never thought I would. I hired a crew and installed a heavy-duty steel gate at the road entrance. Not just a flimsy barrier, but a locked gate with a keypad system, reinforced posts, and security cameras trained on both sides. I put up even more signs. Private road, no HOA access. The message couldn't have been clearer. The day Karen discovered the change was something I'll never forget. She drove up, slammed on her brakes, and jumped out of her SUV, red-faced and shaking with rage. She pounded on the gate, shouting, "You can't do this. You're cutting off the entire neighborhood." But I could, and I had every legal right. Now, instead of enjoying their convenient shortcut, every member of the HOA has to drive the long way around, adding 10 minutes to every trip. The same residents who once cheered for Karen are now glaring at her, blaming her arrogance for the mess she caused. As for me, I sit on my porch with my morning coffee, my fence standing tall, my animals safe, and my road finally respected. Karen wanted a war, but all she got was a locked gate and a lesson in consequences. And that's how standing your ground can turn the tables on even the toughest HOA bullies. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more real-life drama and justice served, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe to HD Stories. Your support helps us keep bringing you more stories you won't believe. They say some people let power go to their head, but I never thought I'd see it over something as ridiculous as a car. My HOA president, Karen, decided she wanted my SUV for herself. When I refused, she called the cops, convinced she could bully me into giving it up. What she didn't know was that I'm not just any homeowner. I'm a federal interior chief, and the moment she brought the police into it, she opened the door to a truth she never wanted exposed. It all started on a Saturday morning, the kind of morning that makes you appreciate living in a quiet suburban neighborhood. The sun was out, the air was crisp, and I finally had a day to myself after a long week of work. I decided to wash my SUV, not because it needed it badly, but because there's something relaxing about cleaning your own vehicle, watching the soap slide down the shiny surface, and knowing you've taken care of something you worked hard for. That SUV wasn't just transportation, it was my pride. I had saved for years to buy it, and every time I looked at it, I felt a sense of accomplishment. But that morning, I had no idea my peaceful routine was about to be interrupted. As I was rinsing the hood, I heard the sharp clack of heels coming down the sidewalk. I didn't even have to look up to know who it was. Karen. She was the HOA president, and to put it kindly, she wore that title like it made her queen of the world. Every neighbor had a story about her. How she nitpicked about the color of someone's flowers, how she sent warning letters over Christmas lights being too bright, or how she once tried to fine a family for having kids' bicycles in their own driveway. Karen wasn't just strict, she was controlling. And now she had her eyes on me. She marched straight into my driveway without asking, hands on her hips, eyes locked on my SUV like it had personally offended her. She didn't bother with a good morning or any kind of courtesy. Instead, she jabbed her finger toward the vehicle and announced, with her usual dramatic flair, that according to new HOA guidelines, oversized vehicles like mine were no longer permitted in the neighborhood. She said it as if she were reading from some official law book, her voice full of authority she didn't really have. But then, almost in the same breath, she shifted gears. Karen suggested that the simplest solution would be for me to sell the SUV directly to her, at a price she had already decided on. She even had the nerve to say it was generous, considering I'd be avoiding fines and penalties by letting her take it off my hands. The way she said it, you would think she was doing me a favor, when really it was nothing more than a shakedown dressed up in HOA language. I wiped my hands on a rag and stared at her for a moment, trying to process the boldness of her demand. This wasn't about neighborhood rules. This wasn't about aesthetics or compliance. This was about Karen seeing something she wanted and deciding she had the power to take it. My SUV wasn't breaking any rule. It was legally registered, it fit neatly in my driveway, and it violated no HOA policy I had ever signed off on. I told her firmly that I wasn't selling my vehicle, especially not to her. My voice was calm, but my message was clear. For a second, she looked stunned, like she couldn't believe someone would dare say no to her. Then her face turned red, her lips tightened, and she leaned closer as if to intimidate me. She hissed that if I didn't hand it over, she would make things very difficult for me. I almost laughed. It sounded like something out of a bad movie. Karen, standing in my driveway, trying to threaten me over my own car. I shook my head, turned back to rinsing the SUV, and told her I wasn't interested in playing games. I figured that would be the end of it, another one of her empty power plays. But little did I know, Karen wasn't bluffing. She had a plan, and she was about to take things further than I ever imagined. A few days passed, and honestly, I thought Karen had finally dropped the issue. She hadn't come around again, and I went about my business like normal. But when it comes to Karen, silence doesn't mean peace. It usually means she's cooking up something bigger. And I found that out one evening when I pulled into my driveway after work. Just as I parked, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street behind me. At first, I thought there had been some kind of accident. But when two police cruisers stopped directly in front of my house, my stomach tightened. Two officers stepped out, one with a notepad in hand, the other scanning the SUV I had just parked. They approached me, their expressions professional but cautious, and one of them asked if I was the registered owner of the vehicle in my driveway. I told them yes, of course it was mine. That's when they explained they had received a report that the SUV was stolen property. My eyebrows shot up in disbelief. Stolen? From who? I asked. Before I could even finish, Karen came power walking across the street, clutching a thick folder of papers like she was about to argue a case in court. With her fake, concerned citizen tone, she told the officers that the SUV didn't belong to me and that I had no right to have it parked in the neighborhood. She claimed she had documents from the HOA that proved I was in violation and insisted the car be impounded until ownership could be verified. She even gestured dramatically, as if she had just uncovered some major crime. The officers looked through her so-called evidence, pages of HOA rules, meeting notes, and even a handwritten fine notice she had drafted herself. Not a single piece of it had anything to do with car ownership. I could tell the officers weren't buying it, but they still had to follow procedure. One of them turned back to me and asked if I could provide proof that the SUV was legally mine. That's when I pulled out my wallet and calmly handed over not just my registration and insurance, but my federal identification card. As the chief of the Department of the Interior for my district, my role isn't just about federal land and housing. I also work closely with local compliance laws and regulations. The officer studied the badge for a moment, then his entire demeanor shifted. Suddenly, I wasn't just some homeowner accused of having a suspicious vehicle. I was a federal officer standing in my own driveway. I explained that Karen's claims were baseless and that her so-called HOA papers had zero legal authority to question ownership of my vehicle. What she had done, knowingly filing a false police report, wasn't just a nuisance. It was a crime. I could see the officers exchanging glances, realizing this situation wasn't about property at all. It was about a power-hungry HOA president trying to bully one of her neighbors into giving up something she wanted. Karen's smirk slowly faded. She opened her mouth to argue, but this time, the officers cut her off. They warned her about the seriousness of filing false reports and reminded her that wasting police resources could carry serious penalties. Standing there in the middle of the street, Karen looked smaller than I had ever seen her. For the first time, she realized she had pushed too far, and she wasn't the one in control anymore. After that night, I knew things couldn't just go back to normal. Karen had crossed a line, and it wasn't one I could ignore. Filing a false police report isn't just petty, it's dangerous. If I hadn't been able to prove who I was, if I hadn't had the right documents on hand, those officers might have towed my SUV or even taken me in for questioning. All because Karen thought she could bully me into giving her what she wanted. So, I decided to take action. With my position as a federal interior chief, I opened an official inquiry into the HOA's activities. At first, I thought it might just be Karen acting out of line. But the deeper I dug, the more disturbing the truth became. Karen had been abusing her position for months, issuing fake fines, creating new rules without approval, and targeting anyone who stood up to her. She pressured homeowners into selling property, manipulated votes, and even pocketed HOA funds under the table. When I presented my findings to the board and the proper authorities, the fallout was swift. Karen was removed from her position immediately. The HOA board faced restructuring, and the community finally got the oversight it had desperately needed. As for Karen, she didn't just lose her title. She faced legal consequences for filing a false police report and misusing HOA authority. The neighborhood felt lighter after that. People walked by my house and thanked me for standing up to her. Families that had once been afraid of her constant threats could finally enjoy their homes without fear of another bogus fine or late-night knock on the door. And as for my SUV, it's still parked proudly in my driveway, a reminder that no one, not even an HOA president with a power trip, can take away what's rightfully mine. If you believe justice always finds its way, hit that like button. Subscribe to HD Stories for more real-life stories where truth wins over abuse. And don't forget to share this video, because someone out there needs to hear it today. Imagine moving into your dream home, only to find out your neighbor, the HOA president, thinks she owns the entire neighborhood. Now picture this. One night, while you're home alone, you hear your front door unlocking, and it's not your wife. It's her. The HOA Karen actually has a key to your house and claims it's her right to check if you're following the rules. And when you confront her, she calls the cops on you. But here's the twist she never saw coming. The officer who shows up is your wife, in full police uniform. What happens next? Let me tell you the whole story. You won't believe what happened the very first week after we moved into our new house. Picture this with me. My wife and I had been saving for years, pinching pennies, working overtime, and skipping vacations just so we could finally buy a place of our own. When we signed those papers and got the keys, it felt like a dream come true. The house wasn't a mansion, but it was ours. It sat in a quiet cul-de-sac lined with neatly trimmed hedges, bright flowers, and houses that all looked like they belonged in a real estate magazine. On that first day, as the moving truck pulled up, I honestly felt like we had made it. We could finally settle down in what looked like the perfect neighborhood. But here's the thing about dreams. Sometimes they come with a hidden nightmare. Ours had a name. The HOA president, better known around the block as Karen. Now, I didn't know it at the time, but Karen was the type of neighbor who thought being HOA president gave her the same authority as a mayor, sheriff, and judge all rolled into one. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was living for them. And unfortunately, we were her brand new targets. I'll never forget that first encounter. We hadn't even finished backing the moving truck into the driveway before she appeared. Hands on her hips, sunglasses pushed up like a crown, lips pursed tighter than a sealed envelope. She looked me and my wife up and down as if we were intruders rather than new homeowners. Without a smile, without even a hello, the first words out of her mouth were, "You can't park that moving truck there. It's blocking the view of the neighborhood sign." I blinked, thinking maybe she was joking, but her face told me otherwise. No trace of humor, no warmth. Just cold, hard disapproval. My wife shot me a look that said, "Is she serious right now?" But before I could respond, Karen went on about how this neighborhood had standards and how every homeowner was expected to follow the community guidelines. Now, I've dealt with tough neighbors before. People who complain about trash cans being left out too long or lawns being an inch too high. But Karen was a whole new level of control. She didn't just care about the rules, she lived for them. It was like she carried the HOA handbook in her pocket, ready to slap it on the table at any moment. The craziest part? She seemed to know everything about everyone already. Who worked from home, who had kids, who left their porch light on too late. She had this air of authority, as if she believed the entire cul-de-sac was her personal kingdom. I tried to laugh it off, brushing it away as just a bad first impression. I told myself, we'll keep our heads down, follow the basics, and stay out of her way. After all, how much trouble could one overbearing neighbor really cause? But deep down, I had this nagging feeling. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She thrived on control, and with us being the newest family in the neighborhood, I had a sinking suspicion that she wasn't going to just leave us alone. And let me tell you, that suspicion turned out to be dead right. That first week went by with little flare-ups here and there. Karen would leave little notes taped to our mailbox about things like, "Your trash cans must be exactly 2 feet from the curb," or "Your lawn edges need trimming." It was annoying, sure, but nothing we couldn't brush off. I told my wife, we'll give it some time, maybe she'll cool down. But Karen didn't cool down. She heated up. One evening, my wife had to work the night shift. Now, here's an important detail. My wife isn't just anyone. She's a police officer, and when she puts on that uniform, people listen. But that night, she wasn't home yet. It was just me, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes in the living room, trying to enjoy a little quiet. That's when I heard it. At first, it was so faint I thought maybe I imagined it. The tiny metallic sound of a key sliding into a lock. My stomach dropped. We'd only given keys to my wife and me. No one else. I froze for a second, heart racing, before I heard the unmistakable click of the doorknob turning. Someone was unlocking my front door. I bolted toward it and yanked it open, and there she was, Karen, standing on my doorstep, holding a key to my house, as if she owned the place. I couldn't believe my eyes. My voice shot out before I could even process. "Karen, what the heck are you doing?" And do you know what she said? Not an apology, not even embarrassment. With a completely straight face, she replied, "I'm just checking. We can't have homeowners leaving their doors unlocked. It's a safety violation." A safety violation. She had just broken into my home, and she was acting like she was doing me a favor. I was furious. "That's not your key. You can't just walk into people's houses," I shouted. But she didn't flinch. In fact, she crossed her arms and said, "As HOA president, I have the right to make sure the neighborhood is secure. If you're not going to follow the rules, I'll call the police myself." I thought she was bluffing. Surely she wouldn't embarrass herself like that. But oh, she was dead serious. Right there, on my porch, after sneaking into my home, she dialed 911. I could hear her talking to dispatch, twisting the whole story around. "Yes, I feel unsafe. He's being aggressive. He refuses to follow HOA policies," she said, glancing at me with this smug little smile like she had just won. In that moment, I realized something. Karen wasn't just a busybody. She was dangerous. She knew how to play the victim, how to manipulate situations, and she thought calling the cops would scare me into submission. But here's what Karen didn't know. The officer who'd be responding to her call wasn't just any cop. It was my wife. And when Karen saw who stepped out of that patrol car, she was about to have the shock of her life. About 15 minutes after Karen's 911 call, headlights rolled across my driveway. Karen straightened her shoulders, arms folded like she was the queen waiting for her guards to arrive. She looked ready to put on a performance. Tears, drama, the whole victim act. I could almost see the script running through her head. She'd cry about how the angry new homeowner was threatening her, and the police would rush to her defense. But life has a funny way of humbling people. The patrol car door opened, and instead of some random officer stepping out, there was my wife, in full police uniform, badge shining, duty belt strapped tight. She carried herself with the kind of authority only years of training could give. And the second Karen saw her, it was like watching a balloon deflate. That smug confidence vanished in an instant. "Good evening, ma'am," my wife said, her tone calm but firm. "Did you call the police?" Karen stammered, eyes wide, voice cracking. "Why, yes, officer. This man, he threatened me. He's refusing to follow HOA rules." My wife raised an eyebrow, glanced at me, then looked straight back at Karen. "Interesting," she said, "because from what I understand, you just attempted to enter my house without permission. Do you want to explain how you had a key to my front door?" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She stuttered something about neighborhood safety and HOA rights, but the words came out weak and hollow. My wife didn't let her off the hook. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice sharp now. "What you did tonight wasn't just inappropriate. It was illegal. Using a key that doesn't belong to you to enter someone's home is called criminal trespassing. And misusing 911 to harass your neighbors? That's filing a false report. I could arrest you right now. Do you understand that?" Karen's face went pale. Her hands shook. The mighty HOA president who barked orders at everyone was now trembling on my porch like a kid caught stealing cookies. "Please, I was just trying to help," she whispered. My wife leaned in slightly, eyes locked on hers. "If I ever hear of you pulling a stunt like this again, there won't be warnings. You'll be in the back of my patrol car headed downtown. Consider this your one and only chance." Karen nodded so quickly I thought her head might spin off. She muttered another excuse before scurrying back across the street, her pride shattered. From that night on, Karen never so much as glanced at our front door again. And as for me and my wife, we finally got the peace we deserved, because sometimes the best way to handle a Karen is to remind her that rules don't make her powerful, the truth does. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like and subscribe for more powerful stories. Stay tuned for the next one right here on HD Stories. When Karen walked into Judge Judy's courtroom, she carried herself like she ruled the world. Chin high, lips pursed, and an attitude that screamed entitlement. But what she didn't know was that this courtroom wasn't her HOA meeting. This was Judge Judy's house. And before the day was over, Judy would expose a dark secret Karen thought she had buried forever. Before we dive in, comment which country you're watching from. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of her neighborhood's HOA, always walking around with a clipboard in one hand and a fake smile on her face. She loved power more than anything else. To her, the HOA wasn't about keeping the community clean. It was about control. She fined families for the smallest things, a mailbox that wasn't shiny enough, a lawn that wasn't trimmed perfectly, even a child's toy left on the driveway for a few minutes. Most neighbors stayed silent, afraid of her endless rules and threats of penalties. But Karen's authority was about to be tested when a new neighbor, Martha, moved in, a single mom with a young daughter and a modest home. Martha was quiet, polite, and worked long hours to make ends meet. She barely had time to unpack when Karen appeared at her door, clipboard ready, pointing out violations. Her tone was smug as she said, "You might be new here, but in my neighborhood, we follow standards." At first, Martha tried to comply. She fixed what she could, repainted her porch, and trimmed the bushes. But weeks later, she found a bright orange paper taped to her door, a $500 fine. The reason? Front porch not up to HOA beauty standards. It felt like an insult, not a rule. When Martha tried to reason with Karen, explaining she couldn't afford such a fine, Karen smirked and said, "If you can't maintain the property, maybe this neighborhood isn't for you." That one sentence broke something inside Martha. She had dealt with arrogance before, but Karen's cruelty pushed her too far. Determined to stand up for herself, she filed a case in small claims court, something no one in the neighborhood had ever dared to do. When the court date arrived, Martha walked in nervously, clutching her papers. But across the room sat Karen, dressed in a flashy suit, chin lifted high, radiating arrogance. And then, the judge entered, Judge Judy. The moment Karen saw her, she rolled her eyes dramatically. Oh, great. This old lady, she muttered under her breath, unaware that the microphones caught everything. Judy looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. She had seen hundreds of rude defendants, but something about Karen's tone struck a nerve. Excuse me, did you just say something, ma'am? Judy asked, her voice slicing through the room. Karen didn't even flinch. Yeah, she said, crossing her arms. This whole thing is stupid. HOA rules are HOA rules. I'm the president, and if she doesn't like it, she can move. The audience gasped softly. Judy raised her eyebrows. You're the president of an HOA, and you're here because your neighbor says you find her unfairly? Karen gave a smug grin. Exactly. She doesn't respect authority. People like her ruin neighborhoods. Judy leaned forward, her eyes sharp. People like her? Karen shrugged casually. You know, lazy renters, single moms, people who don't fit in. The courtroom fell silent. Judy's expression hardened. She had seen arrogance before, but Karen's prejudice was something else entirely. Judy slowly leaned back and said coldly, Mrs. Karen, I've seen all kinds of arrogance in this courtroom, but yours might take the cake. Karen laughed mockingly. Whatever. You wouldn't understand. You don't live in a real neighborhood like ours. Judy's lips curved into a knowing smile. Oh, trust me, I understand far more than you think. And I think it's time you stop pretending to be perfect and start being honest. Karen frowned, confused. What's that supposed to mean? Judy tapped her pen and said, because, according to this file, you have quite an interesting history with the law yourself. Karen's confident smirk slowly faded. The tables were about to turn. The color drained from Karen's face as Judge Judy's words echoed through the courtroom. What? That's not true, she stammered, gripping the sides of her podium. The confident smirk that had lived on her face since the beginning of the hearing was completely gone now. For the first time, she looked nervous. Judge Judy calmly flipped through the folder on her desk, her tone steady but piercing. It says here you were arrested 6 years ago for credit card fraud. Is that correct, Miss Karen? The entire courtroom shifted in their seats. The air felt thick with tension. Martha's eyes widened. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Karen's jaw dropped open. That case was dismissed, she blurted, waving her hands defensively. Judy raised one brow, unimpressed. Actually, it wasn't dismissed, it was reduced. You pled guilty to a lesser charge. That's quite different, don't you think? The audience gasped audibly. Even the bailiff looked up with a raised eyebrow. Karen swallowed hard, her voice trembling now. That has nothing to do with this case. I'm not the one on trial here. But Judy's voice was calm and sharp, cutting through Karen's excuses like a knife. It has everything to do with this case, Miss Karen. You're here accusing a hard-working mother of breaking community rules, calling her lazy, unfit, and disrespectful, when you yourself have broken the law. Worse, you try to hide it. Karen's shoulders sank. Her arrogance began to melt away. I was young, okay? I made a mistake, she muttered. Judy shot her a cold stare. You were 39 years old, Miss Karen. That's not young. That's an age where people are supposed to know better. Her tone grew stronger with every word. And instead of learning from your mistake, you've spent your time pretending to be some kind of queen, using a clipboard and fake authority to bully people who never did anything to you. Karen's face turned bright red. Her voice shook with anger and humiliation. You don't know what it's like trying to run a neighborhood. People don't follow rules, and it all falls apart. Judy didn't hesitate. Oh, I know exactly what it's like to deal with difficult people, she snapped. But there's a difference between enforcing order and enjoying control. What I see here is a woman who hides her insecurity behind power, and the moment she's challenged, she calls people names to feel superior. The audience clapped softly, and even the bailiff tried to hide a grin. Karen's frustration boiled over. She still broke the HOA rule, she yelled, pointing at Martha. Her porch doesn't match the community design. It's ugly. Judy slammed her gavel, the sound echoing through the courtroom. Enough, she barked. You find this woman for something petty and personal. You didn't care about community standards. You cared about control. That's not leadership, Miss Karen. That's harassment. Karen's mouth hung open, but no words came out. Judy turned to Martha, who was holding back tears of relief. Ms. Martha, the court finds in your favor. You owe nothing. Martha gasped softly, her hands trembling as she nodded in gratitude. Judy turned back to Karen, her tone now quieter but firm. And as for you, Miss Karen, I suggest you spend less time policing flower pots and more time fixing your own attitude. Karen's eyes welled up. This isn't fair, she shouted, her voice breaking. Judy stood, her authority filling the room. Fairness, she said firmly, is what you get when you tell the truth. You came here thinking you could lie, bully, and win. But this courtroom doesn't work like your HOA meetings. She paused. Case dismissed. The sound of the gavel hitting the desk made Karen flinch. She turned sharply, muttering insults under her breath as she stomped toward the door. But before she could escape, Judy's voice stopped her one last time. Oh, and Miss Karen? Karen turned halfway, her face red with anger. What now? She snapped. Judy smirked, her tone calm and cutting. Next time you call someone stupid, make sure it's not the person holding your criminal record. The audience burst into laughter. Even Martha cracked a smile through her tears. Karen froze for a moment, then stormed out, her pride shattered and her fake confidence left behind in that courtroom. Judge Judy looked straight into the camera with her signature glare. Bullies always think they're untouchable, until the truth hits harder than a gavel. The camera panned to Martha, who whispered a quiet, "Thank you," before leaving the courtroom victorious. And that day, everyone watching learned a simple truth. You can't hide arrogance behind authority, because sooner or later, the truth always finds you. And that's exactly why no one outsmarts Judge Judy. She doesn't just serve justice, she exposes the truth. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell icon for more gripping courtroom stories from HD Stories. Every episode here reminds us, karma always hits back harder than a gavel.